Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, biblical scholar, and TTRPG designer. That's right, I am designing a tabletop role-playing game, and I figured since I already have a YouTube channel, I may as well document some of my progress on these videos. And so in this video I'm going to be talking about cosmologies for tabletop role-playing games, and how I, developed the cosmology for my game. Now, if you are a TTRPG player, you're probably familiar with Dungeons and Dragons. You might also be familiar with the cult classic Vampire the Masquerade and some of the World of Darkness games. And those are two of my major influences. However, over my life, I've also played Warhammer 40k and a number of other, different tabletop games. And, I've been influenced by all of them. However, I have run into a bit of a problem when it comes to other tabletop role-playing games that exist. And that problem relates to the cosmologies of the TTRPGs. And I'll explain to you what I mean. So, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, for example, you'll know that there are various gods and deities in D&D, and there's magic and monsters and all sorts of things, right? And there's also different planes. There's the elemental plane of fire, and there's different heavenly planes and so on. But the problem is this. Why do those things exist? Why are there deities? And how did they come to become gods? Why does magic exist? Right? What is the underlying logic behind magic in terms of, metaphysical realities? Why does magic exist? When it comes to the elemental plane of fire or the elemental plane of water or whatever, why do those things exist? Within the game, there aren't really any answers for that. D&D is great. It's a great game. I had a lot of fun playing it. But there's not really answers to that. It's just these things kind of are, and you make your character and you have fun, but the deeper questions behind the cosmology within D&D and similar games, the deeper questions of why are not answered, And no offense to the D&D community, but a lot of it is kind of arbitrary, right? So I played D&D back in high school. I had a lot of fun playing D&D, but towards the end of high school and throughout the 2010s, I got into Vampire the Masquerade. Now, I really enjoyed Vampire, partially because it addresses some of the cosmology questions that I just talked about. So within the game of Vampire, it kind of lifts a lot of concepts from biblical metaphysics. It talks about how the first vampire was Cain, and he was cursed after killing his brother and became a vampire, and then that's how. So Vampire has this whole history of how vampires have been woven into the fabric of history, how vampires controlled Carthage, and there was another group of vampires that was in control of Rome, and they defeated Carthage. So Vampire has a lot of the cosmology issues answered, partially because it pulls so much from biblical cosmology. And so I really liked Vampire for that reason, because a lot of those questions were answered. And particularly I used to play on an IRC server. If you've heard of sanguinis.org, it's no longer operational, but it was run by a couple of folks out of Texas, and it was kind of a digital LARP. There were maybe 30 to 40 players at any given time. We simulated an entire city and played vampires within that simulated city, and Sanguinis was especially enjoyable because it took the lore from Vampire, innovated on it a little bit, and had its own metaphysics. And my favorite part of playing that game was discovering the cosmology, discovering the lore through playing various characters. That was the most fun that I had. And so, I guess as a TTRPG designer, I've been looking to recreate that feeling in a game and create that experience for other players. You know, my dream for creating a TTRPG is having players in a world. They play, their characters, and they discover things about the world, right? They discover the lore. They discover the cosmology and the answers to the why questions, right? Why is there magic? Why are there deities? Right? What is the underlying logic driving the whole world, right? That's kind of what I want to do as a TTRPG designer. And interestingly, in my own life, in the real world, I've done a lot of cosmology work, I suppose you could say. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm a physicist and psychology researcher, and I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years discovering and piecing together discoveries that people have made regarding human nature. I've done a bunch of research into various aspects of history, especially modern history and Egyptology. And I'm a biblical scholar, which means I've been diving into biblical metaphysics, Kabbalah, and so on. And so, as a secular and religious researcher, I've put together a whole bunch of different works. This paper, One Concept to Rule Them All, talks about how entropy is a central guiding principle across all human knowledge. And, I've also been doing a whole bunch of research into the relationship between biblical metaphysics and quantum physics, biblical metaphysics and thermodynamics. And I've read a whole bunch of very interesting, very powerful works on the underlying logic driving our world. For example, why did the biblical God create the universe? Why was it created, right? There's actually answers for that. And I talk about some of that on my channel. But anyway, as a TTRPG designer, I realized that I could take everything that I've learned about metaphysics, everything that I've learned about our cosmology and physics and all of these things, and I could take what I've learned, go down to the very foundational answers to the why questions, tweak some of those things, and create an entirely different cosmology. And the cool thing is the cosmology that I've made, it tweaks some of the why answers at the very root of all existence, but at a surface level, it's similar enough that people might not even notice the difference at first glance. So, for example, in the cosmology that I'm designing, there's different elements. There's earth, air, fire, water, light, darkness. But what I have, which other games don't necessarily have, is answers to why, right? Why is there earth, air, fire, and water, light and darkness? Why? What functions do those serve in the overall cosmology? Why are there deities, right? Why does the universe exist at all? Why is there magic? How does magic work, right? And why does it work that way? And so on. So as a cosmology designer, I've been able to create a very, very deep cosmology, which has an underlying logic that drives everything else in the game. And part of what I'm doing right now in my design work is creating a world in a game where players are able to progressively discover the answers to those questions. And the cool thing is there's real world benefit to it as well, because through discovering the answers to those questions, players will be able to discover not just the game world, but also learn about, some of the things that I've discovered, regarding our cosmology. So it's not just discovering the game world, it's also discovering our world. And so that's kind of what I've been up to, and that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Um, the underlying reason why I'm designing a TTRPG at all is related to cosmology. Ultimately I was dissatisfied with, D&D and Warhammer 40K. I find their cosmologies to be interesting but arbitrary. Um, and the lore is quite deep, but the like what I just perceive is a lack of underlying logic that allows for very, very, very deep lore, as opposed to just, you know, supplement after supplement. You know. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm up to. Um, if you're the kind of player that enjoys really, really deep lore and really, really deep cosmologies and all of those things, um, I think you would enjoy my game. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of what I've wanted to share in this video is the cosmology bit. Um, in terms of where I'm at in the design process, I've nailed down most elements of the cosmology. I'm working on world building, and I'm also working with a few people to help me play test a dice system and a combat system. So if you're interested in playtesting, if you run a tabletop group and you have an hour to spend, on a simple combat scenario, you can email me, Zachary at zacharystrong.net, and I'll share with you the playtest document. Um, and if you're interested in hearing more about this game, again, you can email me, Zachary at zacharystrong.net, and I'll put you in an Excel spreadsheet of people to keep updated. So later, I think in later videos, I'm going to talk a little bit about the character creation system. Um, and I've got probably a few other things I'm going to talk about, but today I wanted to talk about cosmology. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and sound off in the comments with your thoughts.